Okay, thank you, Aguru, for the introduction. Yeah, it's very nice to have the chance presenting this paper. We recently revised the paper a little bit, and we look forward to everyone's comments. Right, and also thanks again to Menace and Rick for organizing this workshop. You know, like being in Shanghai is quite distant from the rest of the world, so it's a very precious chance for us. Right, so from title we can see this is paper about the reference effect of government bond for corporate bonds. And we actually use a very unique setting in China. And the benefit of us using China is try to offer some plausible causal evidence for the referencing effect of government bond. Right, so the research question is quite important, both for academic researchers and for policymakers. We wanted to answer the question, how does sovereign bond affect corporate borrowing costs, right? And from a theoretical perspective, it's quite intuitive that sovereign bond might provide a reference role for corporate bonds, right? Just imagine that when we're teaching students the fixed income class, we talk about corporate yield spread. And the way we calculate yield spread is try to subtract the same maturity government bond from the corporate bonds yield, right? And the rationale for government bond that they can provide a reference role is because it helps the investors to better separate the systematic risk component from the firm idiosyncratic component. Right, and once you can understand the systematic risk of a corporate bond, then you might be able to better hedge this macro risk. And then the market might become more liquid and the borrowing cost for those corporates might be lower. And in fact, the World Bank and IMF have been actively advised governments to issue rich sovereign bonds and build a sovereign benchmark yield curve to foster the development of local bond markets. And some of the governments also specified explicitly that they wanted to issue sovereign bonds even if they don't have any deficit needs, right? For example, in Hong Kong, they have this government bond program where they say in their official website explicitly that this government bond program, the primary objective is to promote the further and sustainable development of the local bond market, right? And they wanted to, through implementing this government bond program, they can increase the breadth and depth of the local bond market, right? So, so in this paper, we are trying to give some empirical evidence of this reference rate role of the sovereign bonds. Intuitively, it's quite straightforward, but empirically, to provide evidence for such channel, it's quite difficult. The empirical challenge mainly lies in two aspects. First, in order to examine the issuance of sovereign bond on corporate borrowing costs, we would wanted to have a setting where there originally is very few sovereign bonds outstanding, and then suddenly there is an increase or issuance of sovereign bond. And this issuance of sovereign bond should be relatively exogenous, not related with the market conditions or some changing market credit aspects of the sovereigns and corporates. Right? That's one difficulty. The other difficulty is that because we wanted to examine the effect of sovereign bonds on corporate bonds, so ideally we wanted to have a rich pool of corporate bonds for us to study. Otherwise, we may not have any statistical power to look at the effect on the on the corporate bonds borrowing cost. Well, transitionally, for developed fixed income markets like US, often the case you would see there is already a rich pool of sovereign bonds. So it's difficult to examine an exogenous issuance of sovereign bond on corporate bond cost. Right, so in this paper, then we're trying to tackle these empirical difficulties using a very unique setting in China. So in October 11, 2017, the Chinese Ministry of Finance announced that it would issue 2 billion USD denominated sovereign bonds, split equally into a 5-year and a 10-year maturity. Right, that October 11, 2017 is the announcement day for the issuance. The actual issuance then happened like 10 days later on October 26th. And as mentioned by Abiruk in the Slack, this deal was quite welcomed by the market. The issuance has an oversubscription ratio of 11. That's to say the people that want to buy the bond is 11 times the issuance amount, right? And then the deal was welcomed by the central banks, sovereign wealth funds, mutual funds, etc., all over the world. And also another aspect to see that the deal was very welcomed by the market is to look at the yield, issuance yield. The issuance yield was around like 2.2% for the 5-year maturity bond and 2.7% for the 10-year tenor bond, right? And if you look at that, compare with the nearby Asia countries like South Korea, the yield spread is quite low, right? So that kind of reveal that the markets really welcome this issuance of sovereign bond. For our empirical analysis, however, we are trying to focus more on the announcement date rather than the actual issuance date. The reason is because if the market is quite efficient, then any pricing impact of the issuance of sovereign bond should be reviewed by the market at the announcement rather than at the actual issuance, right? And later on, when we show the yield change around these event windows, we'll find that exactly the market react the most at the announcement date. Also remember in previous slides that we mentioned that the difficulty of the setting is to have a relative rich corporate bond pool, but there is no existence of sovereign bond in this market. And that's exactly the case for our setting. So a little bit more background about the China's fixed income market. So for China government, they can issue bonds in the onshore market. That's the RMB market. They can also issue bonds in the offshore market. And in the offshore market, they can issue USD denominated bond. They can also issue RMB denominated bond, but that's a very tiny market. And we also call it dim sum bond. That's mostly used for the internationalization of the RMB, right? And we can see from this slide, there's some background information. By October 2017, only 2 USD sovereign bonds remain outstanding with a face value of 100 million. That's very tiny for a sovereign bond. And those bonds, one was issued in 1996 and one was issued in 1997. And there is literally no trading of those 2 bonds. And these government have been silent for a long time in this market. So we're trying to argue that if this October 11, 2017 sovereign issuance is literally a very big shock to the market because they make the market from no sovereign to with sovereign bond, right? And turning to the corporate bond market, despite the sovereign government has been very silent on the offshore USD bond market, the corporates actually has been playing a very active role in that market for financing. And by the end of 2017, the USD corporate debt issued by Chinese firms amounted to about 400 billion, right? That amount is tremendous compared to compared to 100 million, right? And from this table, we can also see why this issuance of sovereign bond was a big event for the market. Basically, this table lists the bond issuance amount for corporate and for sovereign governments from year 2007 to 2017, the annual issuance. We make them the value denominated in USD dollar for easy of comparison. So it's obvious to see in the onshore RMB bond market, both the government and corporate are being very active. And this is quite, and this is something everyone knows because China now becomes the second largest fixed income market in the world. Right? What's interesting here is in the offshore USD bond market, we see the government have been silent for a long time. And then in 2017, there is this two issuance of sovereign bond. While the corporates, they have been playing a very active role in the offshore USD bond market for fundraising. Right, so it's not difficult to see when in 2017, the government decided to issue those two sovereign bonds. It's a very big event for the market. And Bloomberg has the headline titled, China to flex market muscles in first dollar bond since 2004. Right, and they say it in the article that while the China's government doesn't need to borrow offshore, right, its bonds will provide a new benchmark for pricing the country's state-owned enterprise. And a successful deal might put on those borrowing costs. That's exactly the article that motivates our original research. And if we look at the official reasons that provided by the Ministry of Finance why they wanted to issue the sovereign bonds, they actually provide a couple of reasons. For example, they wanted to continue the opening of the Chinese financial markets. They also wanted to provide a benchmark for other bonds issued by Chinese entities and to optimize the debt structure, etc. And this second reason highlighted in red is exactly what we wanted to test in this project. Right, so in the follow-up, in the following presentation, I will then go through the data we used for this project and then the main empirical results. So our data would require a couple of multiple data sets because we need both the onshore bonds data where we get from Bloomberg, and we also need some offshore bonds issued by the same issuer. Later, we will use that for control, for test of diff in diff and control the issuer's credit risk. Right, so we get those data and we impose the regular filtering criteria in the literature. So we end up with 553 bonds issued by 284 issuers. And because this bond market is a little bit concentrated on the financial firms, you will see, but still we get a rich sample of bonds and issuers from different industries. Right, so first, let's have so basically this figure conveys the main message of the paper. We wanted to see how the corporate bond, their price, or say the yield, change around the event time. And this figure then plots the yield spread of the corporate USD denominated corporate bonds for the window 60 days before the announcement to 30 days after the announcement. This dotted line denotes the announcement event. That's October 11, 2017. And the solid line denotes the actual issuance, which is 10 days later, right? So from this figure, we can see overall there is a decreasing trend in the yield spread of USD denominated corporate bonds, right? But still, we can see that this decrease, this drop in yield spread is most sharp for the announcement date at t equals to 0, right? And this table shows the univariate analysis of the corporate bond yield spread change. For the one-day window before the announcement to one-day window after the announcement, the yield spread changed by 4 basis points, which is quite large, right? But since we also observed some decrease in the yield spread before the actual announcement date, so in our later analysis, we will focus on a short window measured by the one-day change of the yield spread, and also a long window measured by the average yield change from 1 month before the announcement to 10 days after the actual issuance. And we show empirically that those long window change and short window change yield spread correlation is quite high, around 0.60%, right? Indicating that those two measures are driven by the same underlying factors, right? We also show the yield spread change for different type of issuers, right? The reason for us to do this is because for China, there are different type of issuers. For example, the policy banks, they're very similar. The credit risk of them are very similar to governments. And we also have local government financing vehicle. You could view it as the muni bonds, right? And then we have SOE firms, state-owned enterprise, and non-SOE firms. We actually see the yield spread decrease is prevalent across all different type of issuers, right? And the effect is relatively smaller for policy banks. Part of reason is because they actually bear less credit risk, very similar to the government. Right, so far, hopefully I have conveyed the message that there is a change, a drop in the yield spread of USD denominated corporate bonds, right? Since this is a corporate finance workshop, right, we need to worry about alternative channels, right? So one obvious alternative channels is whether those corporate issuers, they have a sudden improvement in their credit risk around the announcement of the sovereign bond issuance, right? So luckily, we got a very nice way to rule out this alternative. The reason is we are examining the USD denominated corporate bond market, right? And for those corporate firms, they could also issue RMB denominated bonds in the onshore market, right? And since we are examining this reference effect of USD denominated sovereign bond issuance, and in the onshore market, there's already very rich RMB sovereign bonds outstanding there for those corporate bonds to use as a reference, right? So we should imagine for those same issuers, their RMB denominated bond shouldn't have this drop in yield spread around this announcement, right? So the way we do is we collect the firms that have bonds, USD denominated bonds in the offshore market, and also have RMB denominated bonds in the onshore market, right? And then we look at their yield spread change around the announcement, and we regress on this USD dummy that equals 1 if the bond is denominated in USD dollar, right? And we would expect to see that this coefficient of USD is very negative, and the intercept that which captures the yield spread change for onshore RMB bond, there should be no effect there. And this is exactly what we find. And also the magnitude is quite similar to the one that we documented using the univariate test. And when we add additional controls, the effect is still there. Right, another test that we utilize to rule out those credit risk change hypothesis is to utilize the maturity of the bonds. The reason, remember that in the institutional background slide, we talk about the sovereign bond issuance. The government issued 2 bonds, one in maturity of 5 years and the other in maturity of 10 years. Right, so imagine that, just imagine you have a yield curve, term structure of the sovereign bonds. Initially, when it's no sovereign bonds outstanding, that's an empty term structure empty yield curve. And now suddenly there is two data points on that yield curve. One is 5-year and one is 10-year, right? And then through interpolation, we can have a benchmark treasury yield curve for bonds from 5-year to 10-year, right? That's to say, there is a heterogeneous treatment effect among the corporate bonds with different maturities. Bonds with maturity between 5-year and 10-year, they are actually treated the most by the issuance of the sovereign bond because they now have a comparable maturity sovereign bonds, right? But for corporate bonds with maturity less than 5-year or above 10-year, their treatment effect is lesser. And that's exactly what we see in this figure. In this figure, we plot the yield spread change of corporate bonds against their maturities. And exactly we see there's like a V shape there in the sense that the decrease in yield spread is strongest for bonds between 5-year and 10-year maturity, right? And then we use regression-based analysis to further confirm this pattern in the sense that we estimate a piecewise linear regression, allowing the yield spread change to have a linear relationship with the bond maturity, but this linear relationship can be changed for bonds with maturity less than 5-year and bonds with maturity between 5 to 10-year, and for bonds with maturity higher than 10-year. And just consistent with the figure that we just showed, there is a negative relationship between yield spread and the maturity for bonds lesser than 5 years. And for bonds with maturities longer than 10 years, we observe a positive piecewise linear coefficient estimation, which kind of captures the V shape that we see in the scatter plot. Right. Right. So far, after those two tests, not sure if you can be convinced. If not, we still have some placebo tests that can help us to get a sense about the probability distribution that we can observe a similar magnitude of decrease in corporate yield for some placebo events. The way we do is that we create placebo events for the 1 year before the sovereign announcements. That in essence, we have 250 placebo events. And then we calculate the yield spread change for those 1 year placebo events. And we look at our actual decrease of the actual announcement, yield spread decrease for the actual announcement. Where does it lie for the placebo events? Alternatively, you can also view it as a bootstrapping way of calculating the distribution of our announcement events. Right, so the left-hand side figure shows the distribution of the change in yield spread for the placebo events. We can see for our actual event, there is a yield spread decrease of 4 basis points. And there's only 3 placebo days among those 250 placebo days that activate a larger decrease in yield spread. Right, and also consistently, if we look at the t-stat, there is also only 3 days that have a larger t-stat or more negative t-stat than 19.69. That kind of back out a p-value of 1.2% for our actual issuance. We also use those placebo events to estimate our piecewise linear regression. Right, we wanted to see if we use those placebo events and estimate the beta long, beta short, and beta median, then what's the probability that we can also observe that the beta short is negative and beta long is positive? Right, so those two figures then plot the coefficient estimate for beta short and beta long and their corresponding t-values. The dotted line is our actual estimation, and then basically our actual estimation is the intercept of those two lines. And we can only observe 2 data points that have a more negative beta short and more positive beta long compared to our actual estimation. This also reveals that we don't get our results by chance. There's very little probability that we're going to see such a distribution of corporate yield spread for those placebo effects. We also, finally, we also did some further tests to look at the heterogeneous effect for the corporate bonds. The rationale is that the reference role of the sovereign bond on corporate borrowing costs should be higher for riskier bonds than less risky bonds. That's exactly the model prediction by Yuan 2005. Right, so here what we do is that we look at the change in yield spread, conditioning on the riskiness of the bond, and we use investment grade indicator and pre-event bid-ask spread and pre-event volatility to proxy for bonds riskiness. And indeed, we find that the change in yield spread is stronger for non-investment grade bond, for bond with higher bid-ask, and for bonds with higher volatility. Yuan 2005, they also predict that the presence of a reference rate sovereign bond might improve the liquidity and pricing efficiency of those corporate bonds. Right, so we also look at the liquidity of the bond around this event window. Right, to avoid that the change in liquidity is driven by these temporary events, we construct the change in liquidity using the window 1 month before the window that we use to estimate the long window yield spread to avoid any overlapping. And consistent with this change in yield spread, we also observe a decrease in volatility and a decrease in bid-ask spread after this issuance of the sovereign bond. And the result is stronger for bonds with higher riskiness, consistent with the theory prediction. Right. Finally, a little more about the issuance market. Right. So far, we have been saying that there is a pricing impact for the issuance of sovereign bond on corporate bonds. Right. If the borrowing cost for corporate bonds indeed drop for the 5-year to 10-year maturities, then we might observe that the corporates, they issue bonds more toward this 5-year to 10-year maturity brackets after the issuance of sovereign bonds, in the sense that the pricing impact of those corporate bonds might later on affect the issuance decisions of those corporates. Right, so what we do here is we look at the issuance of the bond maturity decisions for the 1 year before the announcement and for the 1 year after the announcement. We look at the distribution of the issuance maturity, and we plot the distribution in green dotted line for the before sample and in red solid line for the after sample. From this figure, it's then very obvious to see that in this market, corporates, they borrow in the maturity of 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year. It's kind of concentrated on those tenors, right? But after this sovereign issuance, however, we see that there is a drop in the distribution of 3-year corporate bonds and an increase in the maturity of 5-year and 10 years, right? And we further use regression-based analysis to estimate the probability of firm issue corporate bonds for the tenor of 5 to 10 years, and regressing on this post-dummy. And we indeed find this is statistically significant in the sense that corporates, they're more likely to issue bonds fall in the 5 to 10 year tenor after the sovereign issuance. But we have a little bit of caveat here, because the sample of the firm that issued the corporate bonds in the 1 year before and 1 year after the event is not many, right? You see that the number of bonds here is only 103. So we have some caveat here, but this issuance result is nice in the sense that it's quite consistent with our pricing implication. Okay, so finally, to conclude, this is a very short paper and it's quite empirical based. We basically wanted to use this very unique Chinese setting to study the interaction between sovereign bonds and corporate bonds. And we provide some empirical evidence, plausible causal evidence that helps to support the reference rate effect of sovereign bonds on corporate borrowing. And we contribute to this literature that studied the substitution and complementarity relationship between sovereign bonds and corporate bonds. There's this very well-known paper by Greenwood, Hansen, Stein in 2010, where they show that there is potentially a gap filling hypothesis in the sense that people might hold high-quality corporate bonds in their portfolio to substitute for government bonds, right? That might provide some evidence indicating that corporate and sovereign might have a substitute relationship. And for the reference rate effect that we are hypothesizing here is more like a complementarity between the corporate and sovereign. Our paper do not want it to rule out gap filling hypothesis because both the gap filling and the reference rate could coexist and might well depend on the relative market size of the sovereign and the corporate. And what is beautiful here is that in this unique setting, we don't have too much sovereign bonds outstanding there, so the role of gap filling to play a big effect is very limited. All right. Finally, the paper might also be beneficial to policymakers because lots of developing countries are thinking about issuing sovereign bonds in USD denominated currencies to help their corporate better finance in the external bond market. A lot of countries are doing so, and also India, for example, is also doing so. So I believe apart from the academic contribution, we might be also helpful for policymakers in the development of fixed income markets. That's basically all I wanted to share.